it's just about time to get started. So before we do, just wanted to let you all know I posted a link to the slides and my notes on my website, which I included in the IRC channel. So if it benefits you at all to follow along in that way, or if the tech cuts out for some reason, you can feel free to download those. So hello, I am Mary Kate Fain, and this is What Free Software Can Learn from Social Justice Movements. A little bit about me before we get started. I currently work as a software engineer at an agency in Philadelphia called PromptWorks. My background, though, is in grassroots organizing. I've worked with a lot of different women's organizations, and really I spent the past 3 years dedicated to doing animal rights work. And that's really where I got the most interested in social justice and how we can create massive change on topics that are not necessarily popular or well known. I'm also a writer, so feel free to stalk my blog if you're interested. So the first thing to go over is that free software is a social justice issue. I think for anyone who attended the talk this morning by Tarek, which was great, that was made pretty clear, the connections between social justice and free software. But to quote Richard Stallman, he says, "Every non-free program is an injustice. The fact that it exists is a social and ethical problem for society. And the goal of the free software movement is to put an end to that." So free software is a threat to individual liberty, as we all know. It limits the liberty of the users of the software if it does not have the 4 freedoms. Free software is also a threat to societal liberty. Proprietary software is a threat to societal liberty. And when we don't have free software in a society that depends very, very deeply on technology, we end up with threats facing our democracy and our human and civil rights, which all very much at this point depend on free software. And in fact, free software is almost becoming a prerequisite to achieving many of the other social justice issues that face the world today, as technology maintains the status quo. There are some differences, though, between free software movement and previous social justice movements. The most obvious difference is that in the past, social justice movements have largely been led by a group of oppressed individuals attempting to overthrow the oppressor class. And this is kind of what you think of in a traditional social justice movement. In the free software movement, those who are using proprietary software are both the oppressed and the oppressor. They're the oppressed because when we use proprietary software, we are limiting our own liberty. But we're also the oppressor because by using proprietary software, we're contributing to the normalization of this lack of freedom, and we're creating the user base which allows the large companies that run proprietary software to maintain their hold on the status quo. But nonetheless, there are many similarities. Martin Luther King Jr. came up with this idea of negative peace, which he wrote about in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And I'm just going to read this quote to you. "The Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action.'" So during MLK's time, what they were seeing prior to the civil rights movement was this negative peace. There was tension that was happening. People of color were experiencing violence, segregation, death. And yet this tension was not being forced to the surface. Your average moderate, your average white person didn't necessarily have to confront this tension on a day-to-day basis. And so they existed in this state of negative peace where conflict and confrontation didn't have to happen. Therefore, society was not forced to address this issue. So what does negative peace look like for software? This is what negative peace looks like. It looks like the person sitting next to you in the coffee shop. It looks like your sister and your mom and everyone around us constantly just participating in this oppressive system, being both oppressed and oppressor, and experiencing no tension. So when they use Google or Facebook or YouTube and do not have to confront the inherent tension that is present in this injustice, we remain in a state of negative peace for the free software movement. Getting over this hump, getting out of the state of negative peace, is a necessary goal. So what is the state of the free software movement then in this negative peace? So my background is in animal rights. In animal rights, we have concepts that may sound kind of familiar. We have an idea of animal welfare, which is concerned about making bigger cages, cleaner air, and slightly less painful lives for those before they are eventually killed in this oppressive system. And then we have animal liberation, which is concerned with entirely abolishing the system that is oppressive, rather replacing it with systems that are free. And while there are arguments certainly on both sides as to whether welfare can be a step in the direction of total liberation in the end, a lot of times what we end up seeing is that welfare encourages complacency. So while many animal advocates who are very passionate about total liberation in the long run are fighting for welfare, this isn't actually changing the status quo when your average user or your average consumer sees an environment of animal care and says, well, it's good enough. They become complacent. In software, we're seeing a very similar thing right now. We're seeing this state of welfare that's happening as companies are starting to realize that embracing open source can be beneficial for their bottom line. This encourages this complacency among developers and the technical community who is coming to this complacent state. I work at a company where we mostly create proprietary software, and it's very common among my coworkers to support a lot of Microsoft's initiatives to move into open source. And the more that this happens, rather than creating incremental steps towards total liberation, which is our end goal, what we're seeing is increased complacency as more and more of the technical community says, well, they're giving back now. Look what they've done. They gave us VS Code or whatever, and they get complacent. I'm not better about VS Code. It's fine. Outside of the technical community, the state of the movement is non-existent, essentially. Your average person on the street, if you ask them what the free software movement is, they would have no clue. If anything, they would assume it was about gratis software. Those who do know that there's a problem, if they even recognize the source of the problem, tend to feel pretty hopeless. A lot of people, just in my day-to-day life at least, will say to you, yes, Facebook is evil, yes, Google knows too much information, and I don't like it, but what can we do? And while on one hand, it has never been easier to leave proprietary software in favor of the many free software alternatives, it's also never been harder with the social pressure that is mounting every single day to use the proprietary systems. People don't feel encouraged in this community, especially those who don't feel directly impacted by the 4 freedoms, if they have even heard of them. But if you're not a technical person, those 4 freedoms probably don't really sound like something that apply to you or matter. So how have past social justice movements gotten over this? How have they left the state of negative tension and moved into a state, of negative peace, moved into a state of positive peace? The Women's Social and Political Union was an organization in the UK that came up around the idea of suffrage. At the time, there were many different suffrage movements happening, and most of them were focused on very non-confrontational tactics. They were having private meetings, there was a lot of letter writing, and general lobbying, behind-the-scenes sort of work. But they were doing that for decades and decades without creating major change. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, on the other hand, founded the Women's Social and Political Union, and their goal was not to play nice in this system. While women's issues were generally considered women's issues and not something that men had to deal with, they made it their goal to make men have to deal with these issues. They started doing disruptive actions. They crashed different political meetings. They crashed different speeches, and they created large disruptive protests of the political activities of the time. They even intentionally got arrested. After they were arrested, they continued to confront the system through their acts of resistance within the prisons by partaking in hunger strikes, which forced them to be force-fed in a manner that really closely resembles a lot of sexual violence that women were facing at the time and fighting against. They forced the system to confront them from start to finish. Eventually, this confrontation did help create the tension, and the WSPU ended up breaking through that barrier, and the suffragettes were successful eventually in gaining suffrage for at least some women, which then continued on to include more women. In the American Civil Rights Movement, as I mentioned, they were facing the state of negative peace. The Greensboro Four participated in the first sit-in at a white-only counter. When they did that, the black waitress who was working there at the time said to them, "Fellows like you make our race look bad." And that woman wasn't against equality, but she was afraid because she was worried that confrontation and tension was going to make her situation worse. And this is a common fear among oppressed peoples, and it's not surprising, and it's not necessarily illogical. But instead what happened is that sit-in took off like wildfire, and across the country we started seeing a movement of sit-ins just like theirs. And what started off as 4 guys at a counter turned into hundreds of people at these segregated establishments. Other forms of direct action were also happening at this time, obviously. And eventually, this state of negative peace was forced into confrontation. And through that confrontation, there was a social crisis created. And the social crisis was so great that those in power, or those even who just felt neutral on the topic, could no longer ignore it. It became such a ubiquitous, common crisis that every person had to deal with it. And then those in power had to deal with it. The AIDS awareness movement used many of the similar tactics. The ACT UP, of course, is very well known for their direct action, including die-ins and disruptive protests where people were arrested. One thing that they also used, though, which became very powerful, is symbology. Symbology is very important and often underappreciated in the power that it can play in creating mass change. The AIDS awareness movement adopted this red ribbon. It was first created by a group called Visual AIDS, and it first came out during the 1991 Tonys. And this ribbon started to just appear on people's lapels. And one by one, the actors who went up would have this ribbon on their lapel. And nobody really knew why. And this was intentional, though, because the company that was broadcasting the Tonys that year refused to let AIDS be mentioned on air. They threatened, actually, to cut the entire program right off the air if AIDS did get mentioned. So these red ribbons were showing up on the actors' lapels, and people didn't know why. And the next morning, the tabloids and the papers were bustling with talk. What are these red ribbons? And soon enough, word got out, they're for AIDS. And this air of symbology and mystery developed around the red ribbon, which has now not only become ubiquitous in and of itself as an AIDS awareness symbol, but the ribbon itself has become copied and replicated over and over again in an attempt to create this powerful symbol. Now, the symbol was very good because it was accessible. This was something that a mother in Wisconsin could use just the same as a student in Berkeley. And having a symbol that's accessible to anyone across any range of demographic is something that's important to creating sustainable growth. More recently, Otpor, which took place in the early aughts in Serbia, was incredibly successful in using both direct action with protests and the power of symbols together at once. They were attempting to overthrow a dictator, Milosevic, and they did this by starting off with, once again, a small group of 12 students. Now, these 12 students, originally they came up with this logo, the fist, and the name Otpor, and eventually, and they just started spray painting it all over. They were spray painting it, they were putting posters up, they were plastering this all over everywhere they could. And the government started to take notice, and they were very concerned. And 4 of those students were initially arrested for spray painting and faced very severe consequences from their judge. The judge actually said in his summary, with their brazen and reckless behavior, the 4 students have endangered the citizens' calm and disturbed the public order. Now, this is ironic because that's, of course, exactly what those students were trying to do. There is no changing the status quo. There is no overthrowing a dictator without changing or without disturbing the public order. So they were entirely successful in this. And the story of these 4 students arrested for spray painting a fist on a wall ended up taking off, and 12 students turned into a massive movement that over the course of about 6 years ended up achieving their goal and overthrowing that dictator. Now, something that's important to point out is there have been many regime overthrows in history and many revolutions one way or another. But this was entirely a nonviolent revolution, at least on the part of the protesters. And this was important. Now, there's a book by Dr. Chenoweth that discusses why this is. And what we see is that nonviolent direct action in the spirit of Gandhi's nonviolence and non-cooperation and Kingian nonviolence tend to be more successful in overthrowing regime than violent actions. There's a lot of reasons why this is, but one of them is because it's more accessible to people. When your grandmother or a child can participate just by showing up, by participating in the symbology, and by supporting without fear of partaking in violence, then that movement becomes successful. It also tends to garner more sympathy from people who have the power to support one side or the other. And what she actually found in her analysis of many regime overthrows over time was that in order for a movement to be successful, if it's nonviolent, it only requires at a maximum 3.5% of the population taking part in sustained nonviolent direct action. And depending on how you think about numbers and people, that can either seem like an awful lot or basically nothing. But this was the maximum that was needed. Once you hit that point, 3.5% of people in nonviolent direct action, your movement was guaranteed, at least historically, to succeed. So if we think about the numbers of people that we have in free software right now and the numbers that we need to hit that point, then we can start to see the path that's laid out for us in actually achieving really the status quo overthrow that we're attempting to do. So according to the Albert Einstein Institute, there are 198 named methods of nonviolent direct action. And this is just a quick screenshot of the list. I encourage you to check it out. And there are so many different things that can be happening. These include strikes, marches, sit-ins, occupations, boycotts, public speeches, etc. And there are nearly 200 things that can be done and utilized by social justice movements. So how many of these right now is the free software movement using? The first one that comes to mind is number 72 on that list, boycott. When we refuse to use proprietary software, we're boycotting. But how many could we be using? I'd like to challenge everyone who's active in the free software movement to consider how many more of these can we be using? And do we need to if we want to actually achieve the abolition of the injustice that we're fighting against? So what could nonviolent direct action for free software look like? For one, there can be protests. We are here gathered at what is, as far as I'm aware, the largest collection of free software advocates that happens in the world annually. Let's take to the streets. Let's march about these issues. When something hits the news about Google or Facebook, why are we sitting quietly behind our screens typing about it? Grassroots action happens in person. And yes, the work that we do online and building community is vital, and the technology that creates alternatives is vital, but creating in-person sustained action is necessary for a movement to succeed. sit-ins at different places that support proprietary software, either headquarters or places that sell software that infringes on our freedom. Marching. All of these things are options. And boycott is important. Boycott shows where we draw the line. Boycott shows alternatives. Boycott makes an ethical statement. But when we do boycott in a vacuum, it's kind of just us sitting alone on our computer. So how can we take this boycott and make it into something that becomes a political statement? This is by taking this power of confrontation and applying it to our daily lives. So confrontation, while yes, it can be this massive, sustained, direct action, can also just be something that we do day to day. A lot of people are scared of confrontation, and I get that. I also am terrified of confrontation, and it's a lot easier said than done. But when you realize that confrontation is necessary to creating change, every little act of nonviolent confrontation can get us one step closer. So we can challenge proprietary software and raise that tension and get us out of the negative piece by bringing some of this into our daily lives. We can do this by denormalizing proprietary software when it's around us. Challenging language. Can you Google that for me? No, but I can search on DuckDuckGo for you. Little things like this. Don't ignore the easy chances to raise the tension. Of course, always in a nonviolent and respectful way. Refusing to use proprietary software is important. And perhaps more importantly, though, is explaining to people why we're doing that. So simply saying, oh, I don't use that, I use this other thing. That's good, that's a start. But when we are given an opportunity to use proprietary software and reject that opportunity, taking the chance to explain to someone, I would love to participate in your online community. However, I choose not to because it infringes on my freedom and the freedom of the society that I'm trying to protect. These little ways that we can add confrontation and advocate for free software are important, and they're the start to creating a sustained on-the-ground movement. Other things we can do are to support free software activists. Don't be the person who says you make us look bad. When people are taking that direct action, support them. Support them in your words, support them financially if you can, support them online by sharing on the free software channels that you have access to. But perhaps most importantly right now, we need to be creating solidarity with other social justice movements. And there are many reasons for this. One of the most important reasons is that they depend on us as much as we depend on them. Now, total liberation is maybe an idealistic dream that I like to think can be achieved, but if it's going to be, these groups have to work together. Many other parts of social movements have recognized this and have started to become more intersectional in their analysis of their oppression. But by working together, we can help their movement become more free, which is necessary for the change that they're trying to achieve. Many activists in different groups, for example, in my experience in the animal rights groups, they don't understand the freedoms that they're giving up and the threats that they're facing by using proprietary software. Hosting workshops to collaborate with other social justice groups and educational seminars, free your tech classes, all of this can help make their movements more free and therefore bring freedom into the next stage of society that they are advocating for. But also by consistently advocating for total liberation, we're going to be making our own movement more inclusive as well. And this is vital. The people who have the most to lose under the reign of proprietary software are those who are already the most oppressed in society. Software defines everything at this point. It is the way that we talk to each other. It's the way that our medicine is run. It's the way that everything happens. Your refrigerator is running on technology. And so those who are already oppressed have the most to lose. By bringing them into the movement, by showing our support for total liberation, we're gaining access to the voices that are traditionally left out of this conversation. And those are the voices that have the power to reach into the hearts and minds of your general population. The people who aren't coders, the people who don't really understand why this matters to them, the people who don't feel like the 4 freedoms would really help them that much because I don't know how to code anyways. By reaching into the hearts and minds of the population who needs this in order to fight for their own liberation, that's how we're going to spark change. Thank you.
If anyone has questions, they can request right now. Oh, there's also that mic here.
What is the book, or what was your reference? Somebody in IRC asked this, so I was just asking, what was the reference for the 3.5%?
Yeah, that's a super good question that I totally blanked on, which is why I didn't say it, but I will actually post a link to it in the chat after this. But the author is Dr. Chenoweth, and I believe it's, no, I'm blanking on the name, but I'll look it up and put it in the chat for you. Yeah. Or if someone wants to web search that real fast and call it out.
So right now, a lot of time, like people reach other people online is through like Facebook or other things that are proprietary. Mm-hmm. So, and for example, I use Pleroma to like Fediverse to talk to my friends, but then they're already talking to people that knows free software and mm-hmm. understands what's happening. So when we are like talking to other people about free software, and we are doing it either through Facebook or we refuse to do it through Facebook, it creates kind of a problem. So how do you think that we should get around it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this is where in-person connection can really shine, is when you have a sustained local community around a particular topic, then you have that face-to-face opportunity to explain why you're not using their preferred method of communication and suggest an alternative. A good example of this is in a group that I used to organize with. We previously were using a Facebook group to organize, as well as Facebook Messenger to communicate. And this is where probably like 90% of communication was happening. If you weren't in the Facebook group and then you weren't seeing the events and you didn't know what was going on, and like it's just how it was. Eventually we had the chance to restructure the group, and in doing that we proposed alternatives. And what we ended up landing on was any sort of internal group communication would be exclusively with free software. So for example, we used Riot as an alternative to a messaging application. And we had parties, we called them, and there was like food and stuff, but which gets people to show off. But we had a party where we would show people how to use Riot. And hey, come on down, I'll install this on your phone, and I'll teach you how to do it, and here's why you don't want to use Facebook in the meantime. And having that in-person connection already allows that to be facilitated. Additionally, and not that I necessarily advocate for this, but having duplicated information can be really helpful. So if there are people in your group who feel that it is very necessary to use Facebook to get your events out and you do not have full control over the organization to say, no, we shouldn't, then you can say, well, okay, you're going to put it there and I can't stop that. But an alternative is to also put them on our website. And so that's what we ended up doing, because there were people in the group, and I wasn't a full dictator, who insisted that events were on Facebook. And so therefore I insisted, well, they're also going to be on our free website that people can access without needing to sell their information. And working with people where they're at can be very helpful. Does that help?
I have a question as a writer. You have a blog. What platform do you use for your blog, and what free software do you use? Do you use Creative Commons licenses and all that?
Yeah. So my blog is on my website, which is run on Wagtail, which is based on Django. And so as a software engineer, I have the privilege of being able to make my own, which is very nice. But there are many Wagtail sites, I believe, out there that you could easily kind of pick up and run from, depending on your technical expertise. And as far as licensing, yes, so all of the work that I create, I try very hard to have it licensed under CC0 as far as writing. I'm working on a book right now that I'm going to be releasing under CC0 as well, and so I have found that to be pretty much fine. I also write for an organization that uses a Medium platform, which I don't believe Medium is free software, but they do allow you to select the license of the content, and so on there I'm able to select a CC0 license for my content.
Thank you so much. That's great. I would add paying attention to what are people talking about on the sidewalk in your neighborhood. I'm very happy to see people so unhappy with Facebook. It makes me feel more normal. And it's the perfect moment to tell them about the federated web, futures in decentralized servers and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think finding people's pain points and then advocating to them based on a empathetic understanding of what they're experiencing is very important. I think I initially struggled even to get interested in free software back when I was more focused on other issues because it was being explained to me in a way that didn't feel relevant to the issues that I cared about. And I think that gaining an understanding of, oh, I hear you're talking about what's going on with your neighborhood gentrification. Here's how free software can help with that. And whatever the issue is that's causing pain to someone, there's almost always a free software connection there, or there's a way that free software can help them overcome that, or there's a way that proprietary software is keeping them down. So yes, I think finding people's pain points and making empathetic connections is vital.
All right, well, thank you so much for giving this talk. This is awesome. But I always find it so hard, especially when dealing with people like my mom, who is completely addicted to Facebook simply because so many people use it and so many of her friends uses it, and she's not all that tech savvy because she's my mom. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard for me to, it's hard for me to describe to her why it's so important for free software to get out there and be this big movement, while at the same time she's using Facebook simply because of its ease of use and the fact that everyone has adopted it. How do we fix adoption in communities that don't really care or have a reason to care? Yeah, so I think that overcoming that base level complacency is going to be necessary before we focus on adoption. And I think this can be the opposite of the way I see a lot of advocacy happening in free software movements, is we do have a lot of focus on just get people to install this distro, just get people to leave Facebook, and then we'll get them on board with why. And I think that can be with many people taking the wrong approach. I think that getting them to care about the why first is important, and overcoming this, yes, the state of negative piece. So most people have, this is kind of going back to what I was saying before, most people have something that they care about. So I don't claim to know your mom, but let's just pretend that she's interested in women's reproductive health. Mm-hmm. So if this is something that your mom cares about, then being able to find the ways that our status quo prevents this. Here are the ways that our status quo is fighting against reproductive justice. And this is something that's going to affect this thing that you care about for yourself, for me, for the future of children. And if this is something you care about, and here's how it's being impacted by the overall state of injustice in the people that are controlling our communication, our ability to organize in a way that's not being surveilled to a certain degree, then this is why these particular software freedoms are important to achieving this goal that you care about. And when we start to make some of these connections, and yes, the software is important just in and of itself for the individual liberties, but
if someone is telling you that they don't care about their individual liberty, you can fight for them and you can try to care about their liberty for them. But you can also find a way that they do care about it. And you can say, well, okay, if you choose to give away this liberty, then that's okay. But it kind of comes back to the free speech issue as well. A lot of people will say, well, I don't have anything to say, so why should I care? Same with the right to not incriminate yourself. People say, like, I'm not guilty, so why do I care about having this Fifth Amendment right? And at least maybe getting them to appreciate, okay, maybe you don't care. I think you should, but maybe you don't. But that doesn't mean that on a societal level, people shouldn't have this freedom. And in the current state, people don't have a valid choice. For many people, leaving Facebook is not a valid option. And that can seem ridiculous to say here, but there are people who depend on it for their businesses. These are largely people who don't have access to certain markets that like this software has given them access to. And so being able to say, well, this woman here who's selling pies on a Facebook group from home, because that's the only thing she can do to support her family, her liberty is being infringed on because maybe she wants to leave this platform, but she feels like she can't for the survival of her family. And if you care about other people's liberty, then at least don't be normalizing this. So that's how I would try it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's time.
Yeah. Oh, God. My contact info is up there, and you can feel free to shoot me an email or otherwise stalk me on whatever platform you prefer. And I'm going to be here for the rest of the conference, so feel free to say hi. Thank you, everyone.